The phone slipped from Ethan Okafor's hand and struck the marble floor with a sound that seemed far louder than it should have been. He didn't bend down to pick it up. He simply stood in the doorway of his bedroom, staring at the two people who had just shattered everything he thought he knew about love and loyalty. One was Serena, his fiancée of 14 months, the woman whose 5 million naira engagement ring was still shining on her finger. The woman whose name had already been printed on wedding invitations waiting downstairs. The other was Marcus Adme, Ethan's chief financial officer, his childhood friend, and the man Ethan had trusted more than almost anyone in his life. Neither of them knew what to say. Ethan didn't scream. He didn't ask for explanations. He simply looked at them for several long seconds, then turned around and walked away. He took the elevator to the private office at the top of Okafor Tower and made 3 calls. First, Serena's access to every property Ethan owned was revoked. Second, Marcus was terminated from the company effective immediately. Third, he called the wedding planner. Cancel everything. The planner tried to explain the deposits, the venue, the guests, the arrangements. Ethan interrupted her. Cancel everything. Then he ended the call. For 6 hours, he sat alone in the darkness of his office. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He simply stared into the silence, slowly realizing something far more painful than the betrayal itself. His entire life had been built around people who might not have loved him at all. Ethan was 34 years old and the CEO of Okafor Consolidated, one of the most powerful business empires in the country. His father had started the company with almost nothing, and Ethan had transformed it into a massive conglomerate spanning real estate, telecommunications, food processing, and infrastructure. Business magazines called him brilliant. Executives called him powerful. Strangers treated him with respect before he even introduced himself. But sitting alone that night, Ethan realized he couldn't name one person who would still choose him if the money disappeared. That thought hurt more than Serena ever could. Early the next morning, his longtime assistant Dara entered his office carrying tea. She had worked beside him for 7 years and knew him well enough to see that something inside him had changed. Ethan looked at her and asked quietly, "Dara, do you think anyone has ever genuinely loved me?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed the cup on his desk and looked directly into his eyes. "I think you're asking the wrong question," Ethan frowned. "Then what should I be asking?" Dara's answer stayed with him. "Whether you would recognize real love if it ever found you." Those words changed something inside him. A few days later, Ethan made a decision that shocked everyone around him. He would disappear. He would leave behind the penthouse, the luxury cars, the designer suits, the business empire, and every visible sign of wealth. He wanted to discover whether anyone could love Ethan the man rather than Ethan the billionaire. He moved into a tiny rented room on the poorer side of Meridian City. His expensive suits were replaced with second-hand clothes. His polished shoes disappeared. He stopped shaving. He found work carrying goods at a local market, washing cars, and running errands for small shopkeepers. His hands became rough. His clothes became dirty. His body became exhausted. Yet strangely, for the first time in years, Ethan felt free. Dara secretly arranged several blind dates for him through a matchmaking service. His profile simply described him as a man who had lost his business and was trying to rebuild his life. The first woman arrived dressed like she had stepped out of a magazine. She took one look at Ethan's worn clothes and rough hands, then suddenly remembered an imaginary appointment. She left after 11 minutes. The second woman was polite but treated the date like a business interview. She wanted to know about his debts, his future prospects, and whether he still had wealthy family connections. Ethan listened carefully and realized she wasn't trying to know him. She was evaluating him. The third woman seemed different. Her name was Lola. She laughed with him, listened to him, and made him feel comfortable. For the first time, Ethan began to believe that perhaps his experiment might work. Then she mentioned that her younger sister was sick and that hospital bills were becoming difficult to manage. Ethan immediately understood. The warmth disappeared from his chest. He quietly placed some money on the table and wished her sister well before leaving. That night, Ethan called Dara. "I'm finished," he said. 3 women. 3 different versions of the same answer. Dara tried to convince him that genuine people still existed. She told him that sometimes real love wasn't found because people were searching for wealth, status, or opportunity. "Then where are those people?" Ethan asked. Dara paused before answering. "Usually, they're not looking for you." They're just living their lives." Ethan remained silent. Then he made one final decision. "I want to go further." "How much further?" Dara asked. Ethan looked down at his worn hands. "Until I have absolutely nothing. No successful businessman story. No potential. No impressive future. Just a man nobody wants," and that was exactly what he became. He bought old clothes from a market stall, stopped eating properly so the hunger would show on his face, and sat at a busy street corner with nothing but a small metal cup in front of him. For the first time in his life, Ethan Okafor became invisible. The first day on the street taught Ethan more about humanity than years inside expensive boardrooms ever had. Some people dropped coins into his cup without even looking at him. Others walked around him as if he were an obstacle on the pavement. Office workers in pressed shirts avoided eye contact. Mothers pulled their children slightly closer. A man sitting inside a luxury car stared at Ethan through the windshield before deliberately looking away. Ethan had donated millions to charities over the years, but he had never understood what it felt like to be the person everyone chose not to see. On the second day, some schoolboys stopped and took pictures of him as part of what they called a social experiment. They laughed while photographing his humiliation. On another day, a woman dropped a tiny amount into his cup and loudly thanked God that her family wasn't like this. By the fifth day, Ethan was exhausted. Then the rain came. It wasn't a gentle shower. Within minutes, the street became flooded, traders rushed to protect their goods, and everyone searched for shelter. Ethan remained seated because he had nowhere to go. His thin shirt was soaked against his body. His head was lowered. Then he heard a voice. "Sir, come quickly." Ethan looked up. A young woman was standing a few feet away holding an umbrella. Her own shoulder was completely exposed to the rain because she was stretching the umbrella toward him. She wore a simple cotton dress. Her fingers were stained with ink, and several fabric samples stuck out from her bag. "Come," she said again. Ethan hesitated. She didn't know him. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that the man sitting in front of her had once controlled a business empire worth billions. To her, he was simply a human being caught in the rain. She led him to a tiny tailoring shop nearby. Inside were sewing machines, fabric rolls, thread, and children's drawings pinned to the wall. She gave him a clean cloth. "Wipe your face," Ethan obeyed. Then she asked the question that shocked him more than anything else that day. "Have you eaten?" He stared at her. Nobody had asked him that question in a long time. Not because they cared about his health, but because people around Ethan had always assumed food would simply appear whenever he wanted it. He shook his head. The woman opened her bag and pulled out a container of rice and stew. "Take it." Ethan hesitated. "I was saving it for later," she explained, "but I had a big breakfast." He knew she was lying. She hadn't eaten enough either. Still, she gave him the food. Her name was Adise. She taught young children in the mornings and operated the small tailoring shop in the afternoons. She didn't interrogate him. She didn't demand his story. She didn't ask how much he earned or where he came from. She simply let him sit there until the rain stopped. Ethan returned the next morning. Then he returned the day after that. Soon, Adise began giving him small jobs in the shop. He delivered clothes to customers, swept the floor, carried fabric, and helped wherever he could. She paid him mostly with food and conversation. Ethan began noticing little things about her. She remembered customers' names. She repaired clothing for elderly people who couldn't afford new ones. She never talked about herself as if she were important, yet somehow she made everyone around her feel important. One evening, she handed Ethan a small brown package. Inside was a shirt she had made from leftover fabric. "Try it," she said. Ethan stared at it. "You made this for me?" She shrugged. "You needed one." He wore it the next day. Adise didn't compliment him. She didn't make a big deal about it. But Ethan caught her smiling when she thought he wasn't looking. For the first time since his life had collapsed, he felt something he couldn't buy. He felt wanted. Then Ethan made a mistake. He wanted to test her one final time. Through Dara, he obtained an envelope containing 50,000 naira and handed it to Adise as a thank you. He watched her carefully, waiting for the familiar transformation he'd seen on so many people's faces when money appeared. But Adise simply stared at the envelope and pushed it back toward him. "Don't do that." Ethan froze. "I just wanted to thank you. I didn't help you because I wanted money." She pushed the envelope back into his hands. "Keep it." Ethan looked at her. "Most people would take it." She smiled slightly. I'm not most people. Then she returned to her sewing machine as if the conversation were finished. Ethan sat there silently. He had finally received his answer. The woman he had been searching for wasn't impressed by his clothes, his story, his money, or his future. She cared about the person sitting in front of her. And for Ethan, that realization was worth more than every billion he had ever owned. As the weeks passed, Ethan became part of Adise's ordinary life. He helped around the shop, delivered finished clothes, and learned how to operate the sewing machine badly enough to make her laugh. He began waking up every morning with something he hadn't experienced in years, a reason to get out of bed. But Ethan knew a secret stood between them. Adise thought he was simply a struggling man trying to rebuild his life. She had no idea that the man sweeping her shop floor was actually the CEO of Okafor Consolidated. One evening, Adise invited him to her mother's birthday celebration. It was a simple family gathering with plastic chairs, homemade food, music, and relatives who had strong opinions about everyone. Ethan felt nervous in a way he had never felt inside a boardroom. Adise's sister looked him over suspiciously. Then her former boyfriend, Rodney, arrived. He worked for Okafor Consolidated and immediately began talking about his company car, his salary, his upcoming business trip, and his importance inside the corporation. Every few minutes, he glanced toward Ethan as if making sure everyone understood the difference between them. Some relatives joined in, subtly mocking Ethan for having no obvious career direction. Adise remained silent until one comment crossed the line. "A man needs direction," someone said. Adise placed her fork down. "His direction is his own business. I didn't invite him here to be measured." The room went silent. Ethan looked at her with an emotion he couldn't explain. Later, while walking home, he finally tried to tell her the truth. "Adise, there's something you don't know about me." She looked at him calmly. "Are you in trouble?" "No, are you a bad person?" Ethan shook his head. "I hope not." She smiled. "Then the rest is just details." That sentence followed him all the way home. Everything he had spent his life believing was important suddenly felt small. His company, his wealth, his position, his family name. To Adise, they were merely details. Ethan called Dara that night. "Enough," he said. 3 weeks later, Adise attended a gathering with some old friends. Ethan went with her wearing his plain clothes. The people there treated him like a joke. Someone made comments about his appearance. Another person asked what kind of job he had. Ethan remained calm. He had survived much worse in boardrooms. But Adise noticed every insult. When the comments became too obvious, she stood beside him and said, "The kind of man someone is isn't written on his clothes." Ethan finally realized there was no reason to continue hiding. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an official document. He placed it on the table. The room went silent. It identified him as Ethan Okafor, CEO and major shareholder of Okafor Consolidated. The people who had laughed moments earlier suddenly couldn't speak. Adise stared at the paper, then at Ethan. He looked into her eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," he said. "I needed to know someone could know me before knowing what I had." Adise was stunned. She didn't immediately celebrate. She didn't ask about the money. She simply asked, "So everything you told me was a lie?" Ethan shook his head. "The name was real. The feelings were real. The life I showed you was incomplete." The story spread online after someone recorded the moment. By the next morning, thousands of people knew that the billionaire CEO had disguised himself as a poor man to find genuine love. Journalists gathered outside Okafor Tower. Ethan eventually held a short press conference. He refused to turn Adise into a publicity stunt. He simply said that he had spent years believing wealth could protect him from loneliness, only to discover that the person who changed his life was a woman who once shared her lunch with him in the rain. That evening, Ethan returned to the corner outside Adise's shop. He carried a ring. It was expensive, but he knew its price didn't matter. He looked at her and said, "I know this changes everything." Adise looked at the ring, then back at him. "It changes everything for you," she replied. "It doesn't change what I felt when you were sitting in that rain." Ethan smiled. "That's the only reason I'm asking." She said yes. The engagement created a storm Ethan had never experienced before. His parents were furious. His father had built Okafor Consolidated through decades of sacrifice and expected Ethan to protect the company's political and business alliances. Adise, in their eyes, came from an ordinary background and had no connection to the powerful families surrounding their business empire. Ethan's mother tried to convince him that marrying Adise could damage the company. His father was even more direct. "You are not just a man making a personal decision," he said. "You are the leader of an institution." Ethan listened quietly. Then he answered, "I've spent my entire adult life building that institution. I gave it everything I had. Now I want to build one thing that belongs to me." His father warned him about the consequences. Ethan didn't change his mind. He was willing to walk away from major partnerships, political connections, and enormous financial opportunities rather than allow anyone to decide whom he should love. The pressure became unbearable for Adise. Journalists waited outside her mother's home. Strangers followed her. People who had never spoken to her suddenly had opinions about her relationship with Ethan. Eventually, Adise told Ethan she needed to leave for a while. She wasn't ending their relationship. She simply needed space. "I'm going to teach my children, sew my clothes, and wait to see what you're made of," she told him. Ethan didn't want her to go, but he respected her decision. Weeks passed. Then Ethan's mother secretly traveled to the small town where Adise was staying. She wanted to see for herself who this woman really was. When she arrived at a local clinic, she found Adise sitting beside an elderly woman, helping her fill out paperwork. She watched as Adise gave her seat to a man with a walking stick. Then she saw Adise quietly repair the broken strap of a young mother's bag. She wasn't performing. There were no cameras. Nobody important was watching. She simply helped because someone needed help. Ethan's mother stayed there for a long time, observing her. Eventually, she approached Adise. They spoke privately. Whatever happened in that conversation changed everything. A few hours later, Ethan received a call from his mother. Her voice was simple. "Come get your woman. Bring her to dinner Sunday." Ethan drove for hours to see Adise. When they met, she told him what his mother had discovered. Ethan had walked away from an 8-figure partnership because the deal came with conditions about his personal life. Adise couldn't believe it. "You gave all that up?" she asked. Ethan looked at her and smiled. "What I built with you is more important." She stepped closer and held him. In that moment, Ethan understood something he had never understood as a billionaire. Sacrifice only feels like sacrifice when you are giving up something you value more than what you're gaining. He had lost money before. He had lost a company deal. He had lost status. But he had found a woman who loved him when he was sitting on a street corner with nothing. The wedding was deliberately simple. Ethan rejected the extravagant venue his family had suggested. Instead, they married in the garden of his family's home, surrounded by close friends and relatives. Adise made her own wedding dress. She stitched it herself, just as she had made countless garments in her small shop. Dara sat in the front row, crying before the ceremony even began. Ethan's parents eventually accepted Adise. His mother danced with her. His father, once convinced the marriage would damage the family empire, eventually understood that his son had made the first decision of his adult life that wasn't driven by money, reputation, or expectation. Ethan had not truly given up billions for love. He had discovered that billions meant nothing when love wasn't real. 5 years later, Okafor Consolidated had not collapsed. Quite the opposite. The company grew stronger because Ethan had finally stopped building his life around appearances and started building it around purpose. New projects focused on affordable housing, education, healthcare, and community infrastructure. Adise created the Crescent Foundation, helping young people from poor neighborhoods learn skills that could change their futures. She taught sewing, business, technology, and entrepreneurship. Her original little tailoring shop remained open. The same children's drawing still hung above the main table, and in a small glass case near the window sat a plastic spoon. It was the same spoon she had once given Ethan on the rainy afternoon when he had nothing. Ethan had framed it. Adise thought the idea was ridiculous. Ethan didn't care. To him, that spoon represented the moment his entire life changed. Every year, on the anniversary of that rainy day, Ethan and Adise returned to Crescent Market. They organized a large community meal. They served food themselves instead of simply donating money and taking photographs. People who remembered Ethan as the silent man with the metal cup now came to shake his hand. He never treated them differently. One evening, Ethan stood at the end of a long table watching his wife laughing with their daughter, Amara. He looked around at the people eating, talking, and celebrating together. Then he remembered the night he had stood in his bedroom doorway and watched his old life collapse. At the time, he had believed it was the worst night of his life. Now he understood that it had been the beginning of his real life. Serena's betrayal had taken away the illusion that money could guarantee love. Marcus's betrayal had taught him that loyalty couldn't be purchased. The failed dates had shown him how quickly people could judge a person based on what they thought he could provide. But Adise had shown him something completely different. She hadn't seen a billionaire. She hadn't seen a CEO. She hadn't seen a powerful family name. She had seen a hungry man sitting alone in the rain and simply asked, "Have you eaten?" She had given him food without expecting anything in return. She had offered him shelter without knowing who he was. She had worked beside him without asking about his wealth. And when he offered her money, she pushed it away. That was the moment Ethan finally understood the difference between being wanted and being loved. He had spent years surrounded by people who wanted access to his world. Adise wanted nothing except the person standing in front of her. Ethan looked at the plastic spoon displayed in its little frame and smiled. He had once believed the richest man was the person with the most money. He no longer believed that. The richest man was the one who had someone beside him when everything else disappeared. And the poorest man was the one who had billions but nobody who loved him for who he truly was. Ethan had once been that poorest man. He would never be again, because somewhere between the billionaire's penthouse and the dirty pavement, between designer suits and second-hand clothes, between betrayal and forgiveness, he discovered the one thing money could never buy: real love. And if this story touched your heart, reminded you that kindness still matters, or made you think about what truly makes someone valuable, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, leave a comment telling us which moment touched you the most, and subscribe for more powerful emotional stories. Sometimes the person who changes your life isn't the richest person in the room. Sometimes there's simply the one who stops in the rain and asks if you're okay.